On a Wednesday morning in October of 1995, a $500,000 crane fell over at a bridge construction site in Carroll County, Iowa. And the only person who could fix the problem was 78 years old, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, and hadn't worn anything but mud boots and overalls in 30 years. Her name was Loretta Dawson. But we'll get to her. First, let me set the scene because the setting matters more than you think. The Middle Raccoon River crosses Carroll County in a long, lazy series of bends through some of the flattest farmland in America. The kind of land where you can see a storm coming from 40 miles away and still get caught in it because there's nowhere to hide. The fields run right up to the edge of the riverbanks, in most places corn and soybeans, giving way to a thin strip of cottonwoods and willows before the water begins. In the fall, when the corn has been harvested and the fields are stubble, you can stand on any slight rise in Carroll County and see clear to the horizon in every direction. The sky is bigger than the land is bigger than the people, and the river runs through all of it, indifferent, unhurried, moving at its own pace toward the Raccoon proper, then the Des Moines, then the Mississippi, then the Gulf as it has for 10,000 years. In 1995, the county was replacing a 2-lane bridge on County Road D25. The old bridge was a Depression-era concrete span that had been built in 1934 by Works Progress Administration crews who were paid 40 cents an hour and laid concrete like men who knew what it meant to have a job. It was a solid bridge for its time. But 61 years of Iowa winter, spring floods, summer heat, and the relentless pounding of grain trucks had turned it into something that made the county engineer wince every time he drove across it. The concrete was cracked. The rebar was exposed in places. The railings had been patched so many times the bridge looked like a quilt made of cement. Every spring, the county engineer would drive across it, listen to the sounds it made, the groans, the clicks, the subtle shifts that a bridge makes when it is thinking about giving up, and submit another repair request that the Board of Supervisors would approve with the enthusiasm of men paying for someone else's funeral. The contract for the replacement went to Mercer Construction out of Des Moines. Mid-size firm, 30 years of bridge work across Iowa. They had built crossings over the Des Moines River, the Iowa River, the Cedar, the Skunk, and a dozen creeks and tributaries whose names only the locals knew. Solid reputation. Not flashy, not cheap, just reliable. The kind of company that got the job done and didn't make the evening news doing it. They bid the Carroll County job at $2.3 million, came in under 4 other contractors, and had boots on the ground by June. The project manager was a man named Grant Hollister. Grant was 45 years old. He had served 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before transitioning to civilian construction, and he had never fully made the transition. He still wore his hair short. He still stood with his shoulders back and his chin level. He still ran his construction sites the way an officer runs a platoon, everything scheduled, everything documented, everything by the book. He kept a clipboard in his left hand and a radio in his right, and God help the man who was 5 minutes late to a concrete pour. He had memorized the project specifications, the way some men memorize scripture, and he could quote load ratings, soil compaction figures, and concrete cure times from memory while walking across a muddy construction site at 6 in the morning without spilling his coffee. Grant had a reputation. In 20 years of civilian construction, he had never missed a deadline. Not once. Not on the I-80 overpass in Newton, not on the Highway 30 bridge outside Ames, not on the county road projects that nobody paid attention to until something went wrong. He brought projects in on time and under budget, and he did it through a combination of meticulous planning, relentless supervision, and a willingness to stand in the rain at 5 in the morning if that was what the schedule required. That reputation was why Mercer gave him the Carroll County job. The bridge was supposed to be done by Thanksgiving. The county wanted it open before winter. The school bus routes depended on it. The grain trucks depended on it. Half the farms on the west side of the river depended on that bridge to get their harvest to the elevator in Carroll, and every day without it was a day those farmers had to drive 20 extra miles on a detour that added 40 minutes to a trip that should have taken 15. Grant intended to make that deadline. He intended it the way some men intend to keep a promise to their dying father. Failure was not a concept he entertained, not in the Army, not in construction, not in any part of his life that mattered. His key piece of equipment was a Liebherr LTM 1160, a mobile crane manufactured in Ehingen, Germany, shipped to Iowa in 3 pieces and assembled on site over 2 days by a team of specialists who spoke in metric units and drank coffee that could strip paint off a gun barrel. It was the crown jewel of Mercer's fleet, $500,000 of hydraulic precision. It could lift 160 metric tons. It could extend its boom 200 feet into the air. It had more computing power in its control cab than the Apollo spacecraft that had carried men to the moon and back. The cab was air-conditioned. The controls were digital. The load management system calculated forces, angles, wind resistance, and ground-bearing pressure in real time, and displayed them on a screen that glowed green when everything was safe and red when it was not. Grant loved that crane the way some men love a particular horse. He had used it on 4 bridges already. He knew its capabilities the way a pilot knows his aircraft by the numbers, yes, but also by feel, by instinct, by the confidence that comes from watching a machine perform flawlessly under pressure again and again until you trust it more than you trust most people. The Liebherr had never failed him, not once. On October 11, 1995, the crane was setting the third of 6 steel girders across the river. Each girder weighed 42 tons and had to be lifted from a flatbed truck on the east bank, swung over the river, and lowered onto the bridge abutments on both sides. Precision work. The kind of work that requires a steady hand, a calm voice, and the ability to move 42 tons of steel through 3-dimensional space with the delicacy of a surgeon suturing a wound. The kind of work the Liebherr was designed for. The kind of work that makes a project manager stand with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching every inch of movement like a man watching surgery on his own child. The crane was positioned on the east bank on ground that the surveyors had certified as stable. They had driven test rods into the soil. They had reviewed geological maps. They had signed documents confirming that the bearing capacity of the east bank was sufficient to support the crane's operational weight under maximum load conditions. 4 hydraulic outriggers, steel legs that extend from the crane's base and press down on wide pads to stabilize the machine, were deployed and locked. Each outrigger pad was 4 feet square, spreading the crane's weight across 16 square feet of Iowa riverbank soil. The operator was a man named Ray Puckett. Ray had been running cranes for 22 years. He had started on a construction crew in Sioux City at 19, graduated to equipment operation at 23, and had been sitting in crane cabs ever since. He had hands as steady as a surgeon's eyes that could judge distance within a quarter inch at 200 feet, and the particular calm that comes from spending 2 decades lifting objects that could kill people if they were dropped. Ray checked his levels, checked his load charts, checked the wind speed 8 miles per hour, well within limits. He gave the thumbs up. The lift started perfectly. The girder rose off the flatbed truck. The steel cables hummed with tension. The boom swung slowly, smoothly over the river. The girder hung in the air like a steel beam, suspended in amber, rotating slightly as the boom tracked across the water. Morning sunlight caught the metal and threw a band of reflected light across the surface of the Middle Raccoon River. The crew watched in silence. They always watched in silence during lifts. Nobody talked. Nobody moved. It was the one moment on a construction site when every man stopped being a worker and became a witness. The girder began its descent toward the abutments. Ray was watching his load indicator on the digital display. 42 tons, well within the crane's capacity at this radius. The green light glowed steady. Everything was nominal. Then he felt something that no crane operator ever wants to feel. The ground moved, not an earthquake, not a tremor, something worse. Something that felt like the earth itself was exhaling, letting go of something it had been holding, relaxing its grip on the surface in a way that was subtle and catastrophic at the same time. The east bank of the Middle Raccoon River, which the surveyors had certified as stable, which had supported the crane for 3 days of lifts without a problem, which had been documented and signed off and filed in a folder that would later become evidence in an insurance dispute, suddenly decided it was not stable anymore. What happened was this. Beneath the surface crust of compacted topsoil and clay, there was a layer of saturated alluvial mud, river silt, deposited over centuries of spring floods. The kind of soil that feels solid when you walk on it, drives test rods through it, even parks equipment on it, until you ask it to bear a concentrated load at a specific angle for a specific duration, and it simply refuses. The soil engineers would later call it a localized bearing capacity failure. What it meant in practical terms was that the ground that had been holding the crane's weight for 3 days had been slowly and visibly compressing, squeezing water out of the saturated layer below, and at 10:47 on the morning of October 11th, 1995, it reached the point where it could not compress anymore and instead chose to fail. The outrigger pad on the riverside, the one bearing the most weight during the swing, punched through the surface crust and sank 18 inches into soft clay in less than 2 seconds, like a man stepping through thin ice into black water, like a table leg breaking through a rotten floor. Ray dropped the girder. Standard emergency procedure. Release the load. He hit the release and the girder fell. 42 tons of structural steel plummeted 40 feet and hit the shallow river with a sound like a building collapsing. It splashed into the water and buried itself in the riverbed mud, sending a geyser of brown water and silt 20 feet into the air. $26,000 of precision fabricated steel, gone, buried in the muck of the Middle Raccoon River like a bone thrown to a dog. But the girder was the least of the problems. The crane was tipping. With one outrigger sunk and the boom still extended over the river, the Liebherr began a slow, sickening lean, the kind of lean that starts so gradually you think it might stop. You think the machine might catch itself. You think the other outriggers might hold. You think physics might make an exception just this once for a $500,000 piece of German engineering. Physics does not make exceptions. The lean accelerated, the way a tree falls, slow at first, then faster, then much faster, then too fast to stop, too fast to think, too fast for anything but the raw animal instinct that says move or die. Ray killed the engine and scrambled out of the cab like a man leaving a burning building. He hit the mud running and didn't stop until he was 50 feet from the machine, his heart slamming against his ribs, his hands shaking, his brain still processing what his body had already understood. The crane's 8-ton counterweight designed to balance loads during lifts was now working against the machine, pulling the back end up as the front end went down. The counterweight that had made the Liebherr stable was now making it unstable. Physics had switched sides, and physics does not negotiate, does not compromise, does not care about deadlines or budgets or the career of the man standing on the bank watching his world tip over. The crane fell in slow motion. Not a crash, more like a giant lying down to sleep. The boom hit the shallow water with a sound like a cannon shot, a deep percussive boom that echoed off the bluffs and sent a plume of mud and river water 50 feet into the air. The cab rotated 90 degrees as the machine settled onto its side, steel grinding against stone and clay, with a sound that made every man on the site wince. The counterweight stood up in the air like a monument to miscalculation. A steel finger pointing at the October sky, accusing the surveyors, the soil, the geological maps, and everyone who had said the ground was stable. It took about 8 seconds from the first shift to the final position. 8 seconds to turn a 4-month project into a disaster. 8 seconds to transform Grant Hollister's unblemished record into a cautionary tale. By the time the mud settled and the river stopped sloshing and the echo of the impact faded into the Iowa distance, a $500,000 crane was lying on its side on the bank of the Middle Raccoon River. Its boom was in the water, half submerged, pointing downstream like a fallen bridge of its own. Its outrigger was buried 3 feet deep in clay that nobody had tested properly. Its cab was rotated at an angle that made it look broken, though the structure was intact. And the green light on the load indicator, the light that had been glowing steadily when the world was still right, had gone dark. Grant Hollister stood on the bank and stared at his crane. He stared at it the way a man stares at a car wreck that used to be his car. Except this was not a car. This was $500,000 of irreplaceable equipment lying in the mud of a river that was supposed to have a bridge over it in 6 weeks. This was his Thanksgiving deadline bleeding out in the October mud. This was his 20-year record of on-time delivery crushed as surely as the clay beneath the outrigger pad. Ray was fine, shaken, muddy, a scraped elbow and a racing heart, but uninjured. That was the first thing Grant checked, because Grant was the kind of man who checked on his people before he checked on his equipment, even when the equipment cost $500,000 and the person cost nothing in accounting terms, but everything in human terms. The girder in the river would need to be fished out, but was probably undamaged. Steel girders are robust. They can survive a 40-foot drop into shallow water. The mud might have cushioned the impact. The girder was a recoverable loss. The crane, however, was a different story entirely. A Liebherr LTM-1160 on its side with one outrigger buried in soft ground next to a river in rural Iowa. That is not a problem you solve with a phone call and a tow truck. That is not a problem you solve with ingenuity and overtime. That is a problem that requires other cranes to solve. Bigger cranes, cranes that can reach the downed machine without driving onto the same soft ground that brought down the first one. Cranes that can generate enough lifting force to right a 160-ton machine from a horizontal position. Cranes that exist in Omaha or Minneapolis or Kansas City, but not in Carroll County, Iowa, where the biggest piece of equipment for 100 miles was currently lying on its side looking like a mechanical corpse. And that is where the trouble really started. Grant made phone calls. Grant was good at phone calls. He was organized. He was clear. He explained the situation in precise technical terms, gave measurements, described soil conditions, provided access, route specifications. He called Mercer's equipment manager in Des Moines. The equipment manager called two crane companies, one in Omaha, one in Minneapolis. Both companies dispatched inspectors. Both inspectors drove to Carroll County, walked along the riverbank with soil probes and measuring tapes, poked the ground, tested the clay, consulted their load charts and their engineering tables and their decades of experience in rigging and recovery. Both came back with the same answer. The ground conditions on the east bank were too unstable to support another crane large enough to right the Liebherr. The clay layer extended at least 60 feet back from the river. The entire east bank from the waterline to the edge of the gravel access road was underlain by the same saturated alluvial silt that had swallowed the outrigger. Any crane heavy enough to lift 160 tons would exert even more ground pressure than the Liebherr. It would sink into the same soft ground before it could even deploy its outriggers. You would be trading one fallen crane for two fallen cranes, and the insurance companies would have a field day, and Grant Hollister's career would be not merely damaged, but destroyed. You need to stabilize the ground first, the inspector from Omaha said. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, a carefully trimmed mustache, and the measured speech of someone who testifies in court regularly and knows the value of precise language. Bring in fill material, gravel, crushed stone, spread it across the bank, compact it with a vibratory roller. Let it settle for at least 2 weeks. Then retest the bearing capacity. If it meets specifications, you can bring in a larger crane. We'd recommend a Liebherr LTM 1300 or equivalent, set it up on the stabilized ground, and perform the recovery lift. How long, Grant asked. 3 to 4 weeks for the ground prep. You're looking at 400 to 600 tons of material, maybe more depending on how deep the soft layer goes. Then compaction. Then settling time. Then we mobilize the recovery crane, which takes another week. Transport, assembly, rigging plan, safety review. Total time. 5 weeks, minimum. Could be 6. 5 weeks. Grant's Thanksgiving deadline was 6 weeks away. The bridge project, which had been running smoothly for 4 months, which had been his proof that Grant Hollister delivered on every promise he made, was about to blow its schedule, its budget, and his reputation. 5 weeks for ground prep and crane mobilization meant the girder lifts would not resume until late November at the earliest. Concrete work could not be done in freezing temperatures. The project would roll into spring. 6 more months, 6 more months of detour, 6 more months of school buses and grain trucks driving 20 extra miles each way. 6 more months of the county board asking questions that Grant did not have answers for. What about a helicopter? Someone asked. There is always someone who suggests a helicopter. On every construction site where something heavy is stuck in a place that wheels cannot reach, someone says the word helicopter, as if it were a magic spell, as if a Sikorsky could appear from thin air and solve the problem with the majestic simplicity of a machine that doesn't need roads. Grant had heard this suggestion before on other jobs. The answer was always the same. The Liebherr weighs 160 tons rigged. The heaviest helicopter lift ever performed in the United States was about 25 tons using a Sikorsky CH-54 Tarhe, and that had been a military operation with a budget that would make a construction company weep. You would need 6 helicopters working simultaneously, coordinating their lift in real time, each one hovering in the rotor wash of the others, while connected to the same load by cables that could tangle and snap. It was physically impossible and financially insane. Drain the area, someone else suggested. Pump the water table down to firm up the soil. We're next to a river, Grant said. The river feeds the water table. You'd be pumping against the entire Middle Raccoon watershed. You'd be pumping forever. Insurance write-off. Grant closed his eyes. Writing off a $500,000 crane was career death. Not figurative career death. Literal, actual, pack your desk and update your resume career death. Mercer Construction had invested $500,000 in the Liebherr. It was the most valuable piece of equipment in their fleet. Writing it off would mean absorbing the loss, which would wipe out the profit on the Carroll County project and 3 other projects combined. The company president would want to know how it happened. The insurance company would investigate. There would be depositions, audits, blame. And at the center of it all would be Grant Hollister, the man who had never missed a deadline, the man who ran his sites by the book, the man whose crane had sunk into soft ground, that had been certified as stable by surveyors that Grant had hired and trusted. The irony was not lost on him. He had done everything right, every procedure, every checklist, every safety protocol, and the ground had betrayed him anyway. The earth itself had broken faith with the documentation. For 4 days, the Liebherr lay on its side while the world argued about what to do with it. Engineers argued about soil mechanics. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. They drilled test borings. They produced reports with charts and graphs that confirmed what everyone already knew. The ground was soft and the crane was heavy, and the two facts together were a problem that money could solve, but time could not. Crane companies argued about liability. Each one said they could perform the recovery in theory, but none of them would guarantee the ground, and without a ground guarantee, the liability fell on the contractor. And the contractor's insurance company had already sent a letter expressing concerns about the operational risk profile of the recovery scenario, which was insurance company language for "we are not paying for this if it goes wrong." Insurance adjusters argued about coverage. The policy covered the crane. It covered the crane for operational use. It covered the crane for transport. It did not explicitly cover the crane for recovery from a position of repose following a ground failure-induced tip-over event. The adjusters were not sure if the policy applied. They needed to consult with the underwriters. The underwriters were in Hartford. Hartford was 3 time zones away and moving at the speed of bureaucracy. And Grant Hollister argued with his own blood pressure, with his own frustration, with the slow, grinding realization that the problem he was facing was not a construction problem at all. It was a physics problem. And physics, unlike construction, does not bend to schedules, budgets, or the iron will of a man who has never missed a deadline. 4 days of phone calls that went nowhere. 4 days of clipboard-carrying men standing on a riverbank, staring at a problem none of them could solve. 4 days of the most expensive piece of equipment in Mercer's fleet lying in the mud like a dead animal that nobody knew how to bury, and everybody was afraid to touch. On the morning of the 5th day, Grant stood on the bank with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and a stack of soil reports that told him nothing he did not already know. The crane lay on its side in exactly the same position it had been in for 96 hours. The river flowed past it indifferently. A crow sat on the counterweight and regarded the scene with the bored detachment of a creature that does not understand human problems and does not care to learn. Grant looked at the crane and felt something he had not felt in 20 years of construction. He felt helpless. Now let me tell you about Loretta Dawson, because understanding the woman is the only way to understand what happened next. Loretta was 78 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in her mud boots and weighed 130 pounds after Sunday dinner, which was the only meal she ate that could be called generous. Breakfast was coffee and toast. Lunch was whatever was left from the night before. She had farmed 480 acres in Carroll County for 30 years by herself ever since her husband, William Dawson, was killed in a tractor rollover in the spring of 1965. William was 41 when he died. Loretta was 48. Their son Clayton was 17, old enough to help, but not old enough to take over. Not yet, not with the kind of operation the Dawson farm required. William had been plowing the North 40 when the front wheel of the farmall caught a rut obscured by standing water. The tractor pitched forward, the steering locked, and the machine rolled. William was thrown clear, but pinned beneath the rear axle. He died before the ambulance arrived from Carroll 12 miles away on roads that were more mud than gravel in the spring. The neighbors came to the funeral. Then they came to the farmhouse. The men stood in the kitchen with their hats in their hands and their faces arranged in the particular expression of sympathy that Iowa farmers have perfected over generations, part concern, part practicality, part the unspoken assessment of what happens next. They told Loretta they were sorry for her loss. They meant it. Carroll County was small enough that every death was felt and every loss was shared. Then they told her she should sell the farm. A woman could not run 480 acres alone, they said. Not in Carroll County, not with the equipment William had, not without a man to operate the heavy machinery, to maintain the buildings, to handle the livestock, to negotiate with the elevator, to deal with the bank. They said it gently. They said it with kindness. They said it with the absolute certainty of men who had never considered the possibility that they might be wrong. Loretta listened to every one of them. She thanked them for coming. She poured them coffee and served them pie that 3 different women from the church had brought that morning, because in Carroll County, grief is managed with baked goods and the quiet presence of women who know that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is fill a kitchen with food and not ask questions. When the last truck pulled out of the driveway, Loretta stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the fields that stretched to the river. 480 acres. Every acre cleared, plowed, planted, and harvested by Dawson hands since Virgil Dawson homesteaded the land in 1892. 3 generations of work. 3 generations of sweat and stubborn Iowa persistence. She could see the machine shed from the window. She could see the dark shape of the Caterpillar 60 through the open door sitting in the shadows where it had sat since Virgil bought it in 1928. She washed the coffee cups, she dried them and put them away. She hung the dish towel on the rack. Then she walked to the machine shed, climbed onto the Caterpillar 60 that her father-in-law had taught her to drive in 1949, 6 years before his death, fired the engine and went back to work. She had been working ever since, 30 years. Through the late 60s, when the war in Vietnam was draining young men from Iowa farms, and Loretta was one of a growing number of women running operations that their husbands and sons had left behind. Through the 70s expansion, when land prices doubled and new equipment appeared at the dealerships every spring, and the Iowa farm economy looked like it would grow forever. Through the 80s crisis, the worst agricultural disaster since the Depression, when commodity prices collapsed and land values cratered and interest rates climbed to levels that made it impossible to service the debt that farmers had taken on during the boom years. Half the farms in Carroll County went under during the 80s. Banks foreclosed. Families lost land that had been in their names for 3 and 4 generations. Auction signs appeared at the ends of driveways like tombstones for the living. Loretta survived. She survived by selling timber from the back 40, which she felled and hauled herself using the Caterpillar. She survived by fixing her own equipment instead of paying mechanics. She survived on eating less, spending less, asking for nothing, and working harder than any person should have to work, man or woman, young or old. She survived by being the most stubborn woman in Carroll County, which is saying something because Carroll County, women had been surviving things since the first sod house was built on the prairie in 1860. Through the 90s, when commodity prices swung like a pendulum, and every year was either too wet or too dry or too something, Loretta kept farming. She watched equipment come and go, gas to diesel, 2-wheel drive to 4-wheel drive, open cabs to enclosed cabs with air conditioning and stereos and GPS guidance systems that could steer a combine across a field with more precision than a human hand. She used some of the new technology and ignored the rest, choosing her tools the way she chose her friends, based on reliability, not fashion, based on whether they worked when it mattered, not whether they looked impressive at the dealership. Now at 78, she was facing something she had never faced before. The county had reassessed land values in Carroll County, and property taxes had nearly doubled. Agricultural land that had been assessed at $800 an acre was now assessed at $1,400. Loretta's 480 acres generated a tax bill of $11,600, up from $6,000 the year before. She did not have $11,600. She had the farm, she had the equipment, she had the crops in the field which would bring money at harvest, but harvest was still 3 weeks away, and the tax bill was due in 30 days. Clayton, her son, had a solution. Clayton was 47 now, running his own operation 30 miles south of Carroll, A leaner, more modern farm that he ran with satellite-guided equipment and computerized accounting, and the efficiency of a man who had studied agricultural economics at Iowa State and believed that farming was a business, not a way of life. "Sell the farm, Mom," Clayton said on the phone every Sunday with the patient insistence of a man who believed he was being reasonable. "Sell the land. The price per acre is the highest it's been in a decade. You'd clear enough to pay off everything and live comfortably in town for the rest of your life." "I'm not moving to town," Loretta said. "You're 78. You can't keep doing this forever." "I'm not doing it forever. I'm doing it today. The equipment is falling apart. The buildings need work. The Caterpillar, don't you talk about the Caterpillar. Mom, it's a museum piece. It's 90 years old." 67. Whatever. The point is your grandfather bought that machine. Your father ran that machine. I've run it for 30 years. It's part of this farm. It's not part of the farm. It's an antique. You could donate it to the Historical Society and take a tax deduction. The conversations always ended the same way. Clayton hanging up with a sigh, Loretta hanging up with a jaw set so hard her teeth ached, and the Caterpillar 60 sitting in the machine shed silent and patient the way it had been sitting since Virgil Dawson drove it off the dealer's lot in Peoria, Illinois in 1928 and parked it on the farm where it would spend the next 67 years doing every piece of heavy work that 3 generations of Dawson farmers asked of it without complaint, without failure, without ever once refusing a task because a computer said it was too hard. Let me tell you about the Caterpillar because she is the reason this story exists. The Caterpillar 60 was built in Peoria, Illinois in 1928, 1 year before the stock market crash, 5 years before the Dust Bowl, the same year Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin and Amelia Earhart flew across the Atlantic, and Herbert Hoover was elected president on a platform of prosperity that would evaporate within 12 months. It was the largest crawler tractor Caterpillar made at the time. 10 tons of cast iron and forged steel powered by a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 65 horsepower at the belt and about 35 at the drawbar. It rode on 2 steel tracks, each 12 feet long and 20 inches wide, studded with grouser bars, steel cleats welded to each track link that gripped any surface. Mud, clay, gravel, frozen ground, wet hillsides, surfaces that would stop a wheeled tractor cold. The Caterpillar 60 did not care what the surface was. It gripped and it pulled and it did not stop. Virgil Dawson bought the machine new for $2,800. In 1928, that was more money than most farms in Carroll County earned in a year. Virgil was a homesteader's son who had worked the Dawson land since he was old enough to hold a plow handle, and he had earned every dollar of that $2,800 through 40 years of 16-hour days through drought and flood and hail and the relentless Iowa cycle of hope and disaster that farmers endure because the only alternative is to stop being a farmer. And Virgil Dawson did not know how to be anything else. He believed that the right tool maintained properly would outlast the man who bought it, and the man after that, and the man after that, or the woman. Though Virgil probably never imagined it would be a woman who kept his machine running longer than anyone else in the family. He was right about everything except the gender. The Caterpillar had been on the Dawson farm for 67 years when the Liebherr crane fell over. It had cleared stumps from fields that Virgil was breaking for the first time. It had pulled combines out of mud during harvest seasons when the rain would not stop. It had dragged buildings, sheds, granaries, even a small barn from one location to another when the farm layout changed. It had moved grain bins, pulled fence posts, cleared fallen trees after ice storms, done every piece of heavy work that 3 generations of Dawson farmers had asked of it. Virgil used the machine until 1952, when he died at 83, still sharp, still working, still firing up the Caterpillar on cold mornings just to hear the engine bark. His son, William Loretta's husband, used it from 52 until 65 when the tractor rollover ended everything. And Loretta had used it ever since. 30 years. The machine had been rebuilt twice. Once in 46 after the war by Virgil and a cousin who had been a mechanic in the Army and knew engines the way a surgeon knows anatomy. They replaced the piston rings, reground the valves, rebuilt the water pump, and repacked every bearing. The machine came out of that rebuild running smoother than it had since it was new. The second rebuild was in '79. Loretta did it with a retired machinist in Carroll named Harold Dunn, a 70-year-old man with emphysema and magic hands who could feel a thousandth of an inch with his fingertips. They spent a winter in the machine shed, 5 months of weekend work, replacing bearings, rebuilding the magneto, reboring the cylinders, replacing every seal and gasket. Loretta did half the labor herself, lying under the machine in her coveralls, hands black with grease hair tied back with a shop rag, while Harold handed her tools and told her she was the most stubborn woman he had ever met. "You say that like it's a bad thing," Loretta said from underneath the machine, tightening a bearing cap with a torque wrench that was almost as old as she was. The restoration cost $3,400 in parts and 5 months of labor that neither of them charged for because Harold said he hadn't had that much fun since the war, and Loretta said she hadn't had that much fun since William was alive, and they left it at that. Since the rebuild, Loretta had fired up the Caterpillar every month, run it around the farmyard, kept the tracks greased and the engine tuned, changed the oil every 100 hours, checked the coolant, adjusted the valves, inspected the track links and pins and grouser bars for wear. She maintained the machine the way Virgil had taught his son, and his son had taught Loretta, and Loretta had taught herself to do even more carefully after William was gone, and there was no one to check her work and no margin for error. She used the Caterpillar for heavy work on the farm 4 or 5 times a year, pulling stumps, dragging stuck equipment, moving things that no other machine on the farm could move. And every summer she took it to the Carroll County Fair for the antique machinery display, where she would park it in the roped-off area next to the other old tractors and let people take photographs and ask questions. Most people who saw the Caterpillar 60 at the fair thought it was a relic, a museum piece, something to look at and marvel over and then go home and forget while they climbed into their air-conditioned trucks and turned on their GPS and drove away on paved roads that the Caterpillar had helped build before those roads existed. Loretta knew better. She knew what the machine could do because she had spent 30 years asking it to do things that modern equipment would not or could not do. The Caterpillar 60 did not have a computer that limited its output. It did not have sensors that cut power when the load exceeded a threshold. It did not have safety systems that protected the machine from overexertion, that calculated stress levels and displayed warnings and refused to operate beyond design parameters. It did not protect itself the way modern machines did. It just pulled. It pulled until the job was done or something broke. And in 67 years on the Dawson farm, nothing had ever broken that Loretta or her husband or her father-in-law could not fix in an afternoon with hand tools and spare parts. Loretta's farmhouse sat on the north side of the construction site. Her kitchen window looked directly down the slope to the riverbank where the Liebherr crane lay on its side like a beached steel whale. She had a clear view of the entire site from her kitchen table where she ate her meals and paid her bills and read the Carroll County newspaper and drank her coffee every morning while the sun came up over the Iowa fields. She had watched the bridge project from that window for 4 months, watched the crews arrive in June, watched them clear the site, watched the old bridge come down piece by piece, the Depression-era concrete breaking apart under the jackhammers like bones crumbling, watched the new abutments go in, watched the crane arrive in 3 pieces on 3 trucks and be assembled over 2 days by men who worked with the calm precision of surgeons. She had watched the first 2 girder lifts and admired the smoothness of the operation, the way the crane moved those 42-ton beams through the air like a magician moving cards. And she had watched the crane go over on the 11th of October and said a quiet word that would have made Virgil Dawson blush and William Dawson smile. And she had watched 4 days of engineers standing around with clipboards and calculators trying to figure out how to pick it up. 4 days. She had pulled a stuck combine out of worse mud than that in 1987 in the rain at night by herself using a kerosene lantern wired to the Caterpillar's radiator for light because the combine's owner couldn't afford to wait until morning, and neither could Loretta. On the morning of the 5th day, Loretta sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and looked out the window at the crane lying in the mud and the engineers standing on the bank with their clipboards and their expensive shoes and their absolute inability to solve a problem that she had been solving in various forms for 30 years. She made her decision. She did not make it lightly. She was 78 years old, and she had no illusions about what that meant. Her back hurt in the mornings, a deep ache in the lower spine that took an hour of movement to work loose. Her hands ached when the weather changed, the knuckles swelling with arthritis that no amount of liniment could fully ease. Her right knee made a sound when she climbed stairs. Her left hip protested when she sat too long. She had buried a husband, survived a farm crisis, and fought her own son to keep the land that 3 generations had worked. She did not need another fight, but she looked out the kitchen window at that crane lying in the mud, and she looked at those engineers with their degrees and their million-dollar budgets standing around for the 5th straight day without a solution, and something shifted inside her. The same thing that had shifted the day after William's funeral when the neighbors told her to sell. The same thing that had shifted during the farm crisis when the bank told her she was done. Not anger, not pride. Something quieter than both and stronger than either. A certainty settled deep in the bones that she knew how to solve this problem. That she had been solving this problem in one form or another since 1965. That the only difference between this and every other time was the price tag on the equipment and the number of men standing around saying it couldn't be done. She put on her overalls. She put on her mud boots. She put on the cap that had the ghost of a seed company logo bleached away by decades of sun, a cap William had gotten free at a farm show in 1963, 2 years before he died, and that Loretta had worn every day since because it still smelled faintly of him, if she pressed her nose to the fabric, though she would never have told anyone that. She drove her John Deere 4440 to the edge of the construction site, parked it at the fence line, and walked down the slope to the riverbank where Grant Hollister was standing with 2 engineers and a stack of soil test reports that had arrived too late to prevent the disaster and too early to solve it. "Morning," Loretta said. Grant barely looked at her. He was holding a phone in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and wearing the expression of a man who has been holding both for 4 days and is starting to forget which one does what. "Site's closed. Insurance." "I'm your neighbor. Farm on the north side." Loretta nodded toward the tipped crane. "I've been watching. Looks like you're stuck." "We're not stuck," Grant said with the clipped tone of a man who has said this sentence 40 times in 4 days and has stopped believing it around the 35th time. "We're assessing options." "You've been assessing options for 5 days," Loretta said. "Your crane's still in the mud." Grant looked at Loretta for the first time, really looked. Overalls, faded blue patched at both knees with denim squares that didn't quite match. Mud boots, brown rubber, the kind that every farmer in Iowa owns and wears until the soles are smooth. White hair pulled back under a cap so faded it had lost its identity. 78 years old and lean as a fence rail. Hands that were brown and cracked and calloused and strong in a way that had nothing to do with the gym and everything to do with 30 years of gripping tools, handles, chains, and the steering clutches of a machine that did not have power steering and required actual physical strength to operate. "What's your point?" Grant said. "I can right that crane." The words landed in the morning air like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spreading outward, silence spreading with them. Nobody moved. One of the engineers, a younger man, maybe 30, with a University of Iowa class ring on his finger and a fresh master's degree in civil engineering that he was very proud of, made a sound that was half cough, half laugh. The kind of sound a person makes when they think they have just heard a joke but are not sure enough to commit to laughing. The other engineer, older, more cautious, looked at his shoes. Grant's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "You," Grant said. He looked at Loretta the way a man looks at someone who has just told him the earth is flat, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular disbelief of a person confronting a statement so disconnected from reality that he does not know where to begin the correction. "You can ride a 160-ton crane." "Not by myself," Loretta said. "With my crawler." "Your what?" "My father-in-law's Caterpillar, 60 model, 1928. We've had it on the farm since new. She'll pull that crane up like she's pulling a stump." Grant Hollister started to laugh, not a small laugh, a real laugh, the kind that bends a man at the waist and makes his hard hat tip forward and turns his face red and makes his eyes water. The kind of laugh that comes not from humor, but from exhaustion and desperation, and the sudden absurdity of a 5'4", 78-year-old farm woman in patched overalls and a faded cap standing on the bank of the Middle Raccoon River, offering to solve a problem that 2 engineering firms and 3 crane companies and a team of surveyors with ground-penetrating radar had declared impossible. The engineers joined in. A couple of workers who had been listening from the trailer steps added their contributions. Someone slapped his knee. Someone else shook his head and muttered something about it being a long week. "A Caterpillar 60, Grant said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "From 1928, you want to write a Liebherr crane 160 tons with a farm tractor from the roaring 20s. That's about the size of it," Loretta said. Her expression had not changed. Her voice had not changed. She stood exactly the way she had been standing when she walked down the slope. Hands at her sides, shoulders square, chin level, looking at Grant with the patience of a woman who had been underestimated before and had stopped caring about it around 1966, which was the year after William died, the year the neighbors came back to check on her and found the spring planting done, the fences repaired, and the Caterpillar running like it had never run better, and realized that Loretta Dawson was not going to sell the farm and was not going to fail and was not going to do anything except exactly what she said she was going to do. "The Caterpillar 60 weighs 10 tons, Grant said. His voice had shifted from amusement to the gentle condescension of a man explaining arithmetic to a child. The voice of a man who is confident in his knowledge and assumes the other person is not. "Your crawler weighs 10 tons. My crane weighs 160. You understand the difference. You can't pull something that weighs 16 times more than you." "You're not lifting it," Loretta said. "You're writing it. There's a difference." Grant stopped laughing. "That crane is on its side." Loretta continued, her voice as steady as the ground she was standing on, which was the solid ground, the uphill ground, the ground that had not failed. "Center of gravity is already past the tipping point. All you need to do is get it started. Rotate it maybe 30 degrees. And gravity does the rest. Once it's past center, it falls back on its tracks under its own weight. You don't need to lift 160 tons. You need to rotate 160 tons past its balance point, and the force required for that is a fraction of the total weight." She said this the way she might explain why you plant corn in May and not April. Simple facts, obvious to anyone who paid attention to the world instead of just the textbooks. "The pulling force to start that rotation with the boom in the water creating drag is roughly 12 to 15 tons, Loretta continued as casually as if she were discussing the weather. "The Cat 60 puts out 65 horsepower at the drawbar. She runs through a 3-speed gearbox. In first gear, she pulls 22,000 pounds at a walking pace. That's 11 tons of sustained pull, but that's on flat ground. I'll be pulling uphill on the angle, which reduces my effective force. But I only need to get the rotation started. Once the crane passes its balance point, I back off and let physics finish the job." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed her first offer. The first silence was disbelief. This silence was recalculation. This was the sound of 3 educated men revising their assumptions about the woman standing in front of them. The younger engineer, the one with the University of Iowa ring, pulled a calculator from his vest pocket and started punching numbers. His fingers moved fast. His eyes moved faster. He was running the tipping force calculation, checking Loretta's math against the principles he had learned in his statics class, which he had aced, which he had been very proud of, and which he was now discovering might not have taught him everything there was to know about how things tip over. Grant stared at Loretta. The condescension had left his face the way color leaves a sunset, slowly at first, then all at once. What replaced it was harder to name. Confusion, maybe. Or the beginning of something that looked like respect, but was not ready to call itself that yet. The beginning of the recognition that the person standing in front of him might know something he did not. "How does a farmer know the tipping force calculation for a Liebherr crane?" Grant said. "I don't know Liebherr cranes," Loretta said. "I know center of gravity, weight distribution, and how things tip. I've been pulling stumps, righting overturned equipment, and dragging stuck machinery out of mud for 30 years by myself. Before that, my husband did it for 20 years, and I watched him and helped him and learned everything he knew. And before that, his father did it for another 20 years with the same machine. Physics doesn't change depending on the price tag." She paused, let the words settle. "Your crane companies won't bring a bigger crane because the ground's too soft. They're right, another heavy crane would sink. But my crawler is different. She's 10 tons spread across 2 tracks, each track 12 feet long and 20 inches wide. That's 40 square feet of ground contact. My ground pressure is about 500 pounds per square foot. Loretta pointed at the fallen crane. Your crane's outrigger pads put down 3,000 pounds per square foot on the same soil. That's why your outrigger punched through and my tracks won't. The engineer with the calculator looked up. His expression had undergone a transformation that would have been comical in any other context. The smirk was gone. The amusement was gone. What replaced them was the face of a man who has just checked someone else's math and found it perfect. Not approximately right. Not close enough. Perfect. She's right about the ground pressure, he said, quietly. The way a man speaks when he is admitting something that costs him. Grant Hollister stood in the mud of a riverbank in Carroll County, Iowa, on the 5th day of a crisis that had consumed his every waking hour, and most of his sleeping ones, looking at a 78-year-old farm woman who had just explained the engineering problem better than 2 engineers holding 6-figure degrees. And she had done it without raising her voice, without consulting a single note, without touching a calculator, and without a trace of smugness. She had done it the way she did everything. Plainly, directly, with the confidence of a person who has tested their knowledge against the real world 1,000 times and knows that it works. If this doesn't work, Grant started. Then you've lost nothing but an afternoon, Loretta said. I'm not charging you. If it works, make a donation to the Carroll County Historical Society. They helped me restore the machine back in '79. They're trying to build a machinery barn for the antique displays at the fair. Grant looked at the crane lying on its side, losing him $20,000 a day in project delays. He looked at his engineers who had been arguing for 5 days without producing a solution. He looked at the stack of soil reports on the trailer table. He looked at the phone in his hand, which had been ringing for 4 days with calls from Mercer headquarters and insurance adjusters and county officials and reporters, and which had not once rung with a call that offered a solution. He looked at Loretta Dawson, who had a solution and asked for nothing. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope. Bring your museum piece, Grant said. But his voice had lost its mockery. There was no laughter in it, no condescension, just the bare, stripped-down voice of a man who has exhausted every option he trusted and is about to try the one he does not. It took Loretta 2 hours to bring the Caterpillar to the construction site. The machine moved at a stately 4 miles an hour on its steel tracks. It did not have a highway gear. It did not have a transport mode. It had 2 speeds, slow and slower, and both of them involved steel tracks chewing up whatever surface the machine was moving across with the same relentless indifference. The grouser bars, the steel cleats on the track links, bit into the gravel road and left marks that looked like a tank had passed through rural Iowa, which in a sense it had. Loretta drove the Caterpillar from the farm across the county road and down the access path to the river. She sat upright on the steel seat with her back straight and her hands steady on the controls. The steering clutches required physical force to operate. There was no power assist, no hydraulic boost, just 2 steel levers connected by linkages to the track drives, and you pulled them with your arms and your shoulders and your back, and you steered the machine with your body as much as your hands. Loretta had been doing this for 30 years. The controls responded to her the way a horse responds to a rider who has been in the saddle since childhood. Not with obedience exactly, but with the kind of understanding that goes deeper than commands. The construction crew heard the machine coming before they saw it. The sound was distinctive, a deep rhythmic barking from the 4-cylinder engine, louder and rawer than any modern machine on the site, deeper, more primal. The kind of sound that vibrates in your chest and makes the ground hum beneath your feet and tells you something serious is coming. Something from another time. Something that does not care about noise regulations or emission standards or the delicate electronic sensibilities of modern equipment. Just a 4-cylinder gasoline engine firing in sequence, exhausting through an open pipe, producing a sound that had not been heard at a construction site since before most of the crew was born. When the Caterpillar 60 crested the small rise above the construction site, the crew stopped working and stared. They could not help it. Some things compel attention not because they are loud or bright or dramatic, but because they are so profoundly out of place that the brain needs a moment to process what the eyes are seeing. A machine from 1928 rolling toward a 1995 construction site, steel tracks on a gravel road, an open engine, no cab, no roof, no windshield, and a small white-haired woman in overalls and mud boots sitting on the steel seat driving the machine with the calm authority of a person who does this every day and has done it for decades and will continue doing it until she decides to stop, which will not be today. The machine was enormous for its era, taller than a man at the radiator cap, wider than a pickup truck, riding on those massive steel tracks that seemed to grip the earth with authority rather than merely resting on it. Each track link was forged steel, heavy as an anchor chain, connected to the next by hardened pins that had not been replaced since the '79 rebuild and did not need to be because they had been made in an era when pins were made to last forever. The engine was exposed, cylinders, manifolds, spark plugs, all visible, working, all making noise. The exhaust pipe pointed straight up and coughed a steady rhythm of blue-gray smoke into the October air. Jesus Christ, one of the workers said. He was 26 years old and had never seen a piece of equipment that did not have a digital display. Is that a tractor or a tank? It's both, said the younger engineer, the one with the calculator. He had been reading about Caterpillar 60s on the trailer computer for the past hour ever since Loretta's ground pressure math had checked out, and his assumptions about farm women and antique tractors had suffered a catastrophic bearing failure of their own. Caterpillar 60, same basic design as the machines that inspired the British to develop tanks in the First World War. The military used them to haul artillery in France. The tracks were the innovation. Before tracks, heavy equipment was limited to firm ground. The Caterpillar could go anywhere. Grant watched the machine approach with an expression that had evolved through several stages over the past 2 hours. Amusement had become uncertainty. Uncertainty had become curiosity. And now watching this massive iron machine lumber down the hill with a small, white-haired woman at the controls, trailing exhaust smoke and leaving track marks in the gravel like the footprints of a prehistoric animal. Curiosity was becoming something that he did not entirely understand. Something that felt like the early stages of awe, though he would not have used that word. The machine was bigger than he had expected, heavier looking, more serious. It did not look like a museum piece anymore. It looked like something that had been built to do exactly what Loretta said it could do. It looked like something that had been doing exactly that for 67 years without complaint. It looked, if Grant was being honest with himself, like the most purposeful piece of equipment he had ever seen. Not the most advanced, not the most capable, but the most purposeful. A machine built for one thing, pulling, and built to do that one thing until the world ended or the engine gave out, whichever came first. Loretta positioned the Caterpillar about 150 feet from the tipped crane on the uphill side. Solid ground, well away from the soft clay of the riverbank. She had chosen the position that morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of graph paper, working out the angles the way Virgil had taught her to work out angles for stump pulling. Distance, elevation, line of pull, anchor point. She had calculated the geometry with the same precision that the engineers use their computers for, except she used a pencil and a memory that contained 30 years of practical experience and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of farmers who had solved problems like this before anyone had invented a computer to tell them it was impossible. She killed the engine. The sudden silence was striking. The barking rhythm that had filled the site for the past 10 minutes simply stopped, and the construction site was quiet in a way it had not been since the morning the crane fell over. Quiet enough to hear the river. Quiet enough to hear the wind in the cottonwoods. Loretta climbed down slowly, 78-year-old joints protesting in the way they always protested, the right knee popping the left hip, catching the lower back, sending a sharp signal that she acknowledged and ignored the way she had acknowledged and ignored it every morning for the past 10 years. She walked to the back of the Caterpillar and began uncoiling a chain. Not just any chain, a logging chain, forged steel links as thick as a man's thumb. Each link solid, seamless, forged from a single piece of steel in a process that produced a chain with no weld points and no weak spots, rated for 30 tons. The same chain Virgil Dawson had bought with the machine in 1928. 67 years old and not a weak link in it. Loretta had inspected every link that morning the way she inspected it before every heavy job. running her hands along the chain, feeling for cracks for wear, for the subtle deformations that would indicate a link was weakening, the way Virgil had taught his son. And his son had taught Loretta. And Loretta had taught herself to do even more carefully after William was gone, and there was no one to check her work and no margin for error. She waded through the soft ground to the crane, carefully testing each step, reading the soil the way she had read soil her entire life. Not with instruments, with her boots, with the way the ground gave beneath her weight, with the sound it made, the soft squelch of saturated clay, the firmer resistance of compacted gravel, the treacherous middle ground where the surface felt solid but the layer beneath was waiting to betray you. She had spent 50 years walking on Iowa soil in all its moods, and she could read it the way a sailor reads water. She hooked the chain to the crane's main frame at a point she had calculated that morning at the kitchen table. Not the top, not the boom, the frame, about two-thirds of the way up from the ground. The lever point that would translate horizontal pull into maximum rotational torque. The point that would give her the best mechanical advantage, the same way a wrench placed at the end of a bolt gives you more leverage than a wrench placed at the center. "Why there?" the younger engineer asked, watching from the bank with his calculator clutched like a talisman. He had walked as close to the soft ground as his shoes would allow, which was not very close. "If I hook too high, I'm fighting the full weight," Loretta said, waist deep in mud, fastening the chain with hands that were as sure and practiced as a surgeon tying a suture. "If I hook too low, I don't get enough rotation. That point right there gives me the best mechanical advantage. The crane wants to rotate around its tracks. I'm helping it do what it already wants to do." She waded back to solid ground, covered in mud to her thighs. Her overalls ruined, though ruin was a relative term for overalls that had been patched 12 times and washed 1,000 times and bore the accumulated stains of 30 years of farm work. She climbed onto the Caterpillar and settled into the steel seat the way a rider settles into a familiar saddle. The seat was cold. It was always cold. There was no padding, no cushion, no ergonomic design. Just a steel plate bolted to the frame, shaped by 67 years of use into a surface that fit the human body only because the human body had adapted to it over time. She fired the engine. The four-cylinder gasoline engine coughed once, a sharp percussive bark, then caught. The ignition settled into its rhythm, that deep, steady barking that filled the riverbank and vibrated in the chests of every man standing on the bank. A sound from another century, from the age when machines were built by hand and operated by feel, and the only computer was the mind of the person sitting at the controls. Grant stood with his arms crossed. The engineers stood with their calculators. The crew stood along the bank, a line of hard hats and high-visibility vests, watching with the intensity of men who have nothing to do but wait and nothing to wait for, but the answer to a question that nobody has been able to answer for 5 days. Several of them had their phones out. Camcorders. The bulky handheld units of 1995, not the sleek devices that would come later. They held them up and pointed them at the Caterpillar and the crane and the chain that connected them, because if this was going to be a disaster, they wanted it on video. And if it was going to be a miracle, they wanted that on video too. Then a black sedan pulled onto the access road and parked behind the equipment trailers. A man got out. Tall, gray suit, polished shoes that were immediately, obviously, catastrophically wrong for a construction site. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that suggested he had driven a long way to deliver bad news and was determined to deliver it whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. His name was Frank Mercer, not related to the construction company. Different Mercer. He was a senior claims adjuster from the insurance company that covered Mercer Construction's equipment fleet. He had been dispatched from the regional office in Des Moines after 4 days of increasingly alarmed phone calls from the home office in Hartford, which had been following the situation through the lens of actuarial tables and loss projections and the particular kind of anxiety that insurance companies experience when a $500,000 piece of equipment is lying on its side in the mud and nobody can agree on how to get it up. "Who's in charge here?" Frank said, picking his way through the mud with the delicacy of a man who has paid $300 for his shoes and is watching the investment depreciate with every step. "I am," Grant said. Frank looked at the Caterpillar, looked at Loretta sitting on the steel seat with her hands on the controls and her white hair stirring in the October wind. looked at the chain running from the ancient machine to the fallen crane. His face underwent a rapid sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, calculation, alarm that ended on something that looked like a combination of outrage and terror. "What the hell is this?" "We're attempting to right the crane," Grant said. His voice was level, the voice of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. With that, Frank pointed at the caterpillar. With a "what is that thing? Is that a museum exhibit? Who authorized this?" "I did." "Mr. Hollister." Frank opened his briefcase with the practiced snap of a man who has opened briefcases in contentious situations many times and finds a certain comfort in the gesture. He produced a folder thick enough to serve as a doorstop. "I need to be very clear with you. If you proceed with this unauthorized recovery attempt using uncertified equipment operated by an uncertified individual—" "She's not uncertified," Grant said. "She's been operating that machine for 30 years. I will have no choice but to void the coverage on the Liebherr. That's $500,000 of equipment, Mr. Hollister. And if any additional damage occurs to the crane, the bridge structure, or any person on this site as a result of this stunt—" Frank paused, searching for a word strong enough to convey his disapproval and settling on one that was not. "The liability falls entirely on you and on Mercer Construction. Am I making myself clear?" The construction site went quiet. Even the Caterpillar's engines seemed to idle lower, as if the machine itself was listening. Grant looked at Frank. Tall, gray-suited, briefcase-clutching Frank, with his polished shoes sinking into the mud, and his folder full of policy clauses, and his absolute certainty that the correct response to a $500,000 problem was to stand on the bank and threaten people with paperwork. Then Grant looked at Loretta. Small, mud-covered, white-haired Loretta sitting on a steel seat on a 67-year-old machine with her hands on the controls and her jaw set and her eyes steady, and a plan that made more engineering sense than anything a certified professional had proposed in 5 days. Then Grant looked at the crane, lying on its side, in the mud, where it had been lying for 5 days, while certified professionals argued about soil mechanics and liability and policy coverage. $500,000 of coverage. His career, his reputation, everything he had built in 20 years of bringing projects in on time and under budget. All of it balanced on a decision he had to make right now in front of 25 men and 1 woman and 1 insurance adjuster with mud on his shoes and a folder full of reasons why everything should stay exactly the way it was. "Your certified solutions," Grant said slowly, each word placed with the precision of a man laying bricks, "have produced 5 days of nothing. 5 days of engineers and crane companies and insurance adjusters standing around with clipboards while my crane rusts in a river and my project bleeds $20,000 a day and the county waits for a bridge they were promised by Thanksgiving. The prudent course of action. The prudent course of action was to test the soil properly before we set up the crane. We didn't, and now we're here. And your prudent course of action for getting us out of here is to wait 5 weeks and spend $100,000 on ground stabilization so that a bigger crane can do what this machine can do this afternoon." Grant turned to Loretta. "Ready?" Loretta did not smile, did not nod with false bravado, did not play to the crowd that was watching from the bank. She simply said, "Ready." "Go ahead," Grant said. He did not sound confident. He did not sound mocking. He sounded like a man who had just bet everything on something he could not predict, something that defied every instinct he had developed in 20 years of by-the-book construction management and had made peace with it. The way you make peace with a decision that is either going to save you or destroy you, and you will not know which until it is over. Frank Mercer stood on the bank with his briefcase and his folder and his voided coverage threat, his polished shoes sinking slowly and irreversibly into the mud of the Middle Raccoon Riverbank, and watched with the expression of a man witnessing a contract violation in real time and knowing that there is nothing he can do to stop it. Loretta put the Caterpillar in first gear. The tracks began to move. Let me tell you about the next 4 minutes, because they are the reason every person at that construction site still talks about this day. The chain went taut, not with a snap, not with a jerk, with a slow, steady tightening that began at the Caterpillar's drawbar and traveled link by link through 67 years of forged steel toward the crane's frame. The links straightened one by one, each one taking up the slack that the one before it had left, until the entire chain was a single rigid line of tension connecting the ancient machine to the modern one, connecting 1928 to 1995, connecting the world that Virgil Dawson built to the world that was trying to solve a problem without him. The caterpillar's tracks bit into the ground. The grouser bar's steel cleats welded to each track link dug into the earth like teeth, like the claws of an animal that has found its footing and will not be moved. Finding purchase, gripping solid ground beneath the soft surface. The tracks churned slowly, deliberately, each revolution pressing the grouser bars deeper into the soil and pulling the chain tighter. For 10 seconds, nothing visible happened. The chain was tight. The caterpillar was pulling. The crane was not moving. To every man standing on the bank, it looked like nothing was happening. It looked like the chain was tight and the machine was straining and the crane was ignoring both with the massive indifference of 160 tons of steel that does not want to be moved. But something was happening that the eyes could not see. Somewhere inside that massive steel frame, forces were shifting. The crane's center of gravity was moving infinitesimally, at first a fraction of a degree of rotation invisible to anyone standing on the bank, but as real as the river flowing past and the wind blowing across the bluff and the planet spinning beneath all of them. The chain was transmitting force. The force was becoming torque. The torque was working against the crane's weight, trying to rotate it, trying to push it past the balance point where gravity would switch sides. Loretta knew this. She could feel it. Not see it, feel it. Through the steel seat, through the vibration of the engine, through the tension in the steering clutches, through 30 years of experience that had taught her to read the language of force and resistance, and the moment when one begins to overcome the other. She kept the throttle steady. She was not trying to jerk the crane over. That would snap the chain and possibly topple the caterpillar itself, 10 tons of machine flipping backward off its own tracks. A nightmare scenario. She was applying constant patient force. The same kind of force Virgil had applied when pulling stumps in the 1920s, white oak stumps with root systems that went 10 feet deep and spread 20 feet wide, and held onto the earth with the tenacity of things that had been growing for a century and did not want to leave. The same kind of force William had applied when dragging equipment out of flooded fields during the spring thaws when the Iowa mud was alive and hungry and held onto anything that touched it. The same kind of force Loretta had applied 100 times on her own in the dark and the rain and the mud alone. Not fast, not flashy, just relentless. The kind of force that does not give up because it does not know how. At the 20-second mark, the crane moved. Not much. An inch, maybe two. A slight rotation of the massive frame around its grounded tracks. The upper structure lifting fractionally from the mud, which released it with a sucking sound, reluctant, as if the earth did not want to give back what it had taken. A sound came from the crane's frame metal, stressed by forces it had not been designed to experience from this direction. A groan, deep and resonant and almost alive. The kind of sound a ship makes when it shifts on the ways. The kind of sound a bridge makes in a high wind. The sound of something massive being asked to move and beginning, reluctantly, to comply. "It's moving," someone said, quietly, almost a whisper. Like saying it too loud might jinx it. Like the crane might hear and decide to stop. Loretta did not hear. She was focused on the caterpillar, on the engine sound, on the track tension, on the feel of the machine through the steel seat. She had spent 30 years learning to read this machine the way a rider reads a horse, through vibration, through resistance, through the subtle language of metal and power and mechanical sympathy that no manual can teach and no computer can replicate. She knew what the engine sounded like when it was pulling hard. She knew what it sounded like when it was pulling too hard. She knew the difference between strain and distress, between a machine that was working and a machine that was about to break, and the caterpillar was working. She pushed the throttle forward a quarter inch, a tiny adjustment. The difference between 35 horsepower at the drawbar and 38, but on a 10-ton machine pulling against a 160-ton crane, 3 horsepower was the difference between almost enough and just enough. The caterpillar's engine note deepened. The exhaust bark became heavier, more insistent. The tracks gripped harder, throwing small clods of earth behind them in rhythmic arcs. The chain hummed with tension. Not a slack hum, a tight hum, the sound of steel under load vibrating at a frequency that you could feel in your teeth if you stood close enough. A sound like a guitar string tuned past its range, past the point where music ends and physics begins. Every person on the bank held their breath. The crane moved again. 5 degrees of rotation. Then 8. The boom began to lift from the water, slowly dripping, shedding river water and mud, rising like a mechanical arm reaching for the sky. Water cascaded from the boom in long silver threads that caught the October sunlight and turned to briefly beautiful curtains of light before falling back to the river. Holy, Grant said. He was not laughing anymore. His arms were no longer crossed. They hung at his sides and his hands were clenched into fists, not from anger, but from the involuntary tension of a man watching something he cannot control and cannot look away from. 10 degrees. 15. Then the chain slipped. The hook point shifted on the crane's frame. 2 inches, maybe 3. The chain went slack for a heartbeat. A single terrible infinite heartbeat during which the chain hung loose and the crane stopped rotating and the boom settled back toward the water and every man on the bank felt his stomach drop. The crane stopped. The rotation reversed. The boom dropped 6 inches toward the water with a splash that sent a ripple across the river. The construction site made a sound, a collective gasp, the sound of 25 men who had been holding their breath and had just had the air knocked out of them. The sound of hope dying. "It's done," Frank Mercer said, and there was relief in his voice. Not relief for the project. Relief that the experiment had failed and the world could go back to operating the way he understood it, with certified equipment and authorized procedures and proper documentation. Pull her back before something breaks. Loretta killed the Caterpillar's throttle. The engine dropped to idle, the barking rhythm softening to a mutter. She climbed down from the machine. 78 years old, covered in mud to her waist, her back screaming, her hands aching, her right knee sending sharp signals of protest that she registered and dismissed the way she dismissed everything that stood between her and the thing she had decided to do. She walked toward the crane, not away from it, toward it. "Where is she going?" Grant said. Loretta waded back into the soft ground, back to the crane, back to the chain. She waded through mud that rose to her thighs, then to her waist, the clay sucking at her boots with every step trying to hold her, trying to keep her, and she kept going the way she had kept going through everything else in her life, by refusing to stop. She reached the hook point and knelt in the mud. It came up to her chest. She was almost completely submerged in the soft clay riverbank, a small white-haired woman kneeling in mud that could have swallowed her, examining a chain hook on a $500,000 crane with her hands, feeling the metal, reading it with her fingers the way a blind woman reads Braille, understanding through touch what had happened and what needed to happen next. The hook had slipped because the frame surface was muddy, slick with river silt and clay. The chain had no purchase, no bite. It had been resting on a smooth surface, and when the load reached its peak, the hook had simply slid along the frame to a point of lower resistance. She needed a better bite. Loretta unhooked the chain, repositioned it 4 inches to the right, where a welded structural joint created a natural notch in the frame, a small ridge of weld bead that would grip the chain link and prevent it from sliding. Then she wrapped the chain once around a structural cross member and hooked it back on itself. A self-cinching connection. The harder the pull, the tighter the grip. The more force applied, the more secure the attachment became. She had learned this technique from Virgil. Her father-in-law had used it to pull stumps that were rooted deeper than they looked. White oak stumps, hickory stumps, the kind of stumps that laughed at a straight pull because their root systems spread wider than the tree above them and held onto the earth with a grip that was almost personal, almost stubborn, almost alive. Virgil would wrap the chain around the stump itself and hook it back so that every pound of pull tightened the chain further, and the stump's own resistance became the mechanism of its removal. The trick was to let the force work for you, to make the pull secure itself. Loretta waded back to solid ground. Her overalls were black with mud. Her cap was askew. Her white hair was plastered to her forehead. She looked like she had been wrestling the earth itself, and in a way she had. She climbed the Caterpillar, settled into the seat. Her hands found the controls with the automatic certainty of 30 years of muscle memory. She gripped the throttle. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, not from weakness. From the kind of adrenaline that a 78-year-old body produces when it understands at a level deeper than thought that everything depends on the next 2 minutes. That 30 years of solitary work, 30 years of proving every doubter wrong, 30 years of holding a farm and a family and a legacy together with nothing but her hands and her will, and a machine that did not know when to quit, all of it came down to this. She took one breath, deep, drawing the October air into her lungs and holding it, feeling her heartbeat, feeling the cold steel of the throttle under her fingers, feeling the weight of the moment. Then another breath. Then she engaged the throttle. The Caterpillar's engine rose from idle to working power. The tracks engaged. The chain went taut again. Tighter this time. The self-cinching wrap bit into the crane's frame with a grip that tightened under load. The chain links pulling against the weld ridge and the cross member locking themselves into place with the mechanical certainty of a design that Virgil Dawson had perfected on white oak stumps 70 years ago. The Caterpillar pulled, the grouser bars bit, and the crane began to move. It moved immediately this time. No hesitation, no long, silent pause while invisible forces accumulated. The chain was secure, the pull point was right, and the crane's center of gravity had already been shifted past the first 5 degrees during the initial attempt. It was closer to its balance point than it had been, closer to the moment when gravity would stop being the enemy and start being the ally. 5 degrees, 10, 15. The boom rose from the water. This time it kept rising, no slip, no pause. Water cascaded from the steel in long sheets, catching the light falling back to the river in a curtain of silver. The crane's counterweight was beginning to work in Loretta's favor now. 8 tons of counterweight that had been sitting at the wrong angle contributing to the tip was now rising toward vertical. And as it rose, its mass, which had been part of the problem, became part of the solution. The higher the counterweight climbed, the more it pulled the crane toward upright. The more the center of gravity shifted, the less force Loretta needed to apply. The physics was reversing itself. The same equation that had tipped the crane 5 days ago was now with a 30-degree rotation and a steady pull from a 67-year-old machine riding it, 20 degrees. The chain sang with tension, a high, clear note that cut through the engine noise and the murmur of the crowd and the sound of the river and hung in the October air like a bell tone. 25 degrees. Loretta could feel it, through the steel seat, through the controls, through every nerve and muscle and bone in her 78-year-old body, the moment when the crane's own weight began to do the work. The resistance on the chain eased. Not all at once. Gradually. The way a door eases open when you push it past the sticking point. The way a boulder eases off a ledge when you lever it past its balance. The Caterpillar's engine note lightened. The track stopped churning so hard. The grouser bars stopped throwing earth. The machine was still pulling, but the pull was becoming easier because the crane was doing more and more of the work itself, past its balance point, committed, falling back the other way. Not because Loretta was pulling it, but because gravity was pulling it, and gravity is patient and irresistible and does not stop until the job is done. Loretta eased the throttle back. "She's going," she said, to nobody in particular, to the machine, to Virgil, who had bought it when Coolidge was president, to William, who had run it until the day the farm all rolled and took him away, to every person who had ever told her she could not do this, or anything else. She could not run the farm. She could not fix the equipment. She could not survive the crisis. She could not keep going year after year alone on 480 acres of Iowa farmland with nothing but her own hands and her own mind and a 67-year-old machine that did not know the meaning of the word quit. The crane fell back onto its tracks. The impact shook the ground, not like an earthquake, like a statement, like a period at the end of a sentence. The crane hit its tracks with a shuddering metallic crash that sent a wave of mud across the riverbank and vibrated through the soil for 50 feet in every direction. The boom whipped through the air as the machine came upright, shedding water and mud in a spectacular arc. The cab rotated back to its proper position with a grinding sound that made the mechanics wince, and the insurance adjuster close his eyes. The crane rocked once forward. The counterweight swung past vertical and pulled it back. The crane rocked once back, settled forward, and then it was still. standing upright, on its own tracks, battered, muddy, one outrigger bent at an angle that would need repair, hydraulic fluid weeping from a cracked line on the boom assembly, cosmetic dents and scratches covering every surface, but structurally intact, mechanically recoverable, standing, for the first time in 5 days. Silence, absolute silence, the kind of silence that exists in the gap between an event and the brain's comprehension of what the event means. The silence of 25 construction workers, 2 engineers, 1 project manager, 1 insurance adjuster, and 1 78-year-old farm woman on a 67-year-old machine, all staring at a crane that was standing upright and, according to every certified professional opinion rendered in the past 5 days, should not have been. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the cheering started. It hit like a wave breaking on a shore. Men shouting, whistling, the sharp crack of hard hats being slapped against thighs, fists pumping in the air. 2 workers grabbed each other in a bear hug that would have been embarrassing on any other day and was the most natural thing in the world on this one. The younger engineer, the one with the calculator and the University of Iowa ring, threw the calculator straight up into the air, watched it arc against the October sky, and caught it with one hand. Someone blasted a truck horn. 3 long blasts that echoed off the bluffs and scattered a flock of crows from the cottonwoods. Someone else started clapping, and the clapping spread like fire through dry grass until every person on the site was applauding a ragged, joyful, defiant thunder that rolled across the riverbank of the Middle Raccoon River and out over the fields of Carroll County and up into the Iowa sky. Frank Mercer stood in the mud. His polished wet shoes were ruined beyond any possibility of restoration. His briefcase was spotted with clay. His folder of policy clauses and coverage limitations hung at his side like a flag that no longer represented a country. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The crane was standing. The project was saved. And the woman on the antique tractor had done what his entire industry, the engineers, the crane companies, the inspectors, the surveyors, the adjusters, all of them with their degrees and their certifications and their computers and their decades of institutional expertise, had declared impossible. Grant Hollister did not cheer. He walked slowly, deliberately, from the bank to where Loretta sat on the Caterpillar. The engine was still idling. The chain lay slack on the ground, spent like a muscle that has given everything it has. The barking rhythm of the 4-cylinder engine had softened into something that sounded almost peaceful now. The sound of a machine at rest. The sound of work completed. Grant stood at the base of the Caterpillar and looked up at Loretta. She was covered in mud from her boots to her collar. Her white hair had come loose from under her cap and hung around her face in damp strands. Her hands, resting on the steering clutches, were trembling with the aftershock of effort. She looked exhausted and entirely calm, the way a person looks when they have just done the thing they were put on earth to do. The way a person looks when every doubt, every insult, every year of being told they are too old, too small, too female, too stubborn, too wrong, all of it has been answered. Not with words. With 4 minutes of work. Grant did not say anything for a long time. The cheering continued behind him. Workers were laughing now, the laughter of released tension, the giddy euphoria that follows the end of a crisis. But between Grant and Loretta there was silence. The kind of silence that exists between 2 people who have just shared something that does not fit neatly into words. The silence after a verdict. The silence after a confession. The silence after a prayer is answered by something that looks nothing like what you expected and everything like what you needed. "How much do I owe you?" Grant finally said. "Donation to the Historical Society," Loretta said. "Whatever you think is fair." What's fair for saving a $500,000 crane and a $20 million bridge project? 10,000 would make them pretty happy. They're trying to build a machinery barn for the antique displays at the fair. Grant nodded. He reached up and shook Loretta's hand. A handshake that started formal and ended long. His hand engulfed hers, his wide and calloused from 20 years of construction work, hers small and rough from 30 years of farming alone, and neither of them let go quickly. Neither of them wanted to. Some handshakes are transactions. This one was a bridge connecting 2 people who had started the day on opposite sides of a gap and ended it standing on the same ground. "I want to ask you something," Grant said. "You're engineers. Your crane companies, people with degrees and million-dollar budgets. They couldn't solve this problem in 5 days. How did you solve it in 4 minutes? Loretta shut down the engine. The sudden silence was as dramatic as the rescue itself. The barking rhythm that had filled the riverbank for the past 10 minutes simply stopped, and in its place there was only the sound of the river and the wind and the distant murmur of men telling each other what they had just seen, the way men do when they have witnessed something extraordinary and need to say it out loud to make it real. She climbed down from the machine slowly, 78-year-old joints protesting the way they always protested. She leaned against the caterpillar's track, massive steel cold to the touch, solid as the earth it was designed to grip, the way a person leans against something they trust completely, the way you lean against a wall that has never let you fall. Your engineers were trying to lift the crane, Loretta said. They wanted to pick it up. That's the modern way. Apply force greater than the weight of the object. Overpower the problem. She paused. Let the words settle the way a teacher lets a lesson settle before moving on. But I wasn't trying to lift it. I was trying to tip it. Different problem, different math, different solution entirely. She tapped the crawler's track with her knuckle. The sound rang out clear and metallic like a bell struck once in an empty church. This machine was built in 1928. No computers, no hydraulics, no sensors. Just an engine, a gearbox, and two steel tracks. It doesn't know how much it's supposed to pull. It doesn't have a load limiter. It doesn't shut itself down when things get hard. She looked at Grant. It just pulls until I tell it to stop. Your modern cranes, they're smarter than this machine. They protect themselves. They calculate loads and refuse to exceed them. They measure stress levels and shut down before anything breaks. That's good engineering for normal operations. Smart design, safe design. Her eyes were steady, clear, the eyes of a woman who has seen 78 years of life and has not flinched from any of it. But when you need to do something that isn't normal, when you need to pull past what the computer says is safe, when the problem is bigger than the manual and the solution isn't in the textbook, the smart machine won't let you try on. She smiled for the first time since she had walked down to the riverbank that morning. A small smile, quiet, the kind that lives more in the eyes than the mouth, the kind that means something only if you know what it cost. My dumb machine will. Grant was quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of reconsideration, full of the reorganization of assumptions, full of the slow recognition that he has just learned something that no school could have taught him. My grandfather ran equipment, Grant said, heavy equipment, before computers, before hydraulics, before all of it. He used to say that the operator was the safety system. Your grandfather was right, Loretta said. The person is the computer. And the person has to be smarter than the machine. Whether the machine is 67 years old or 6 months old. The machine doesn't know what needs to be done. The person does. Grant nodded, not the quick automatic nod of a man being polite. The slow, deliberate nod of a man filing something away in a place where he keeps the things that matter, the things that change the way he sees the world. He looked at the crane standing upright on the bank. He looked at Loretta leaning against her crawler. He looked at the river flowing past as if nothing had happened, because rivers do not care about cranes or deadlines or the small dramas of the people who build bridges over them. Rivers just flow, the way machines just pull, the way people just keep going when there is work to be done. Mrs. Dawson, Grant said, you just made the best engineering decision I've seen in 20 years of construction, and you did it with a machine from the Coolidge administration. Hoover, Loretta corrected. 28 was still Coolidge. Hoover took office in 29. Grant laughed, a real laugh this time, not the mocking laugh from the morning, the one that had bent him at the waist and turned his face red. A different kind of laugh, the laugh of genuine earned respect, the laugh of a man who has been taught something by the last person he expected to teach him anything and is grateful for the lesson. Now let me tell you about what happened after, because the story does not end at the riverbank. The best stories never end where you expect them to. They keep going the way rivers keep going, the way machines keep running, the way people keep living after the moment that defines them. The Liebherr crane needed repairs. A bent outrigger that had to be replaced, the one that had sunk into the soft ground and been bent by the fall. Some hydraulic line damage on the boom assembly, cracked fittings, and a blown seal that leaked fluid down the boom like tears. Cosmetic dents and scratches that covered every surface and told the story of 5 days lying in the mud. But nothing structural. The frame was intact. The turntable was intact. The boom miraculously was undamaged. Mercer's mechanics had the crane back in service within 2 weeks. The remaining 3 girders were set without incident. Each one lifted from the flatbed truck, swung across the river, and lowered onto the abutments with the precision that the Liebherr was built for. Grant Hollister stood on the bank during every lift, arms crossed, jaw set, watching every inch of movement. But now the crane was positioned on the west bank on ground that had been tested 3 times by 3 different firms with soil reports that were 40 pages long and signed by people who knew that their signatures would be checked. Grant Hollister made his Thanksgiving deadline. The bridge opened on schedule. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, a small ceremony. The county supervisors cut a ribbon. The local newspaper sent a photographer. A few dozen people stood on the bridge and looked down at the Middle Raccoon River, which flowed beneath them with the same indifference it had shown when the crane fell and the crane was righted and the bridge was built. The first vehicle to cross the new bridge was a Carroll County school bus. Bus number 7, carrying 23 children to Carroll Elementary School. The children looked out the windows at the river and the fields in the October sky, and none of them had any idea what it had taken to put the bridge under their wheels. Grant wrote a check for $15,000 to the Carroll County Historical Society. $5,000 more than Loretta had asked for because Grant Hollister understood that some debts cannot be measured by what the creditor requests, but only by what the debtor owes. He wrote a letter to Mercer Construction's president, a 3-page letter that was the most honest document he had ever produced, explaining in precise detail what had happened on the riverbank and recommending that the company donate an additional $10,000 to the society. Mercer's president read the letter twice. Then he approved the donation without discussion because the letter made clear that the alternative to Loretta's solution would have been a spring delay, a budget overrun, and an insurance claim that would have cost the company 5 times the donation. The total came to $25,000, enough to build a proper machinery barn at the Carroll County Fairgrounds, with concrete floors and steel walls and display space for a dozen antique machines. The Caterpillar 60 was the first machine displayed in the new barn, placed in the center on a slightly elevated platform that Harold Dunn had suggested and that the Historical Society's board had approved unanimously. A brass plaque was mounted on a post in front of the machine. It read, "This machine righted a $500,000 crane on October 16, 1995, operated by Loretta Dawson." Virgil would have liked that plaque. He would have liked it because it was plain and direct and said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more the way Virgil liked all things to be. William would have liked it even more. He would have liked it because it had Loretta's name on it, and William had always believed that Loretta could do anything she set her mind to, and he had been right, and the plaque was proof. Frank Mercer, the insurance adjuster, not the construction company, filed his report with the regional office in Des Moines. The report was 12 pages long. It described the crane failure, the recovery options that had been explored and rejected, and the method that had ultimately been employed. The official language described the recovery as an alternative stabilization method performed under site manager supervision using legacy equipment. Bureaucratic language for the farm woman was right, and we were wrong, but we would rather eat glass than say so in writing. The coverage was not voided. The claim was processed. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in Hartford, Connecticut, there is a folder that contains the most unlikely equipment recovery report in the history of heavy construction insurance. But none of that is the part of the story that matters most. The part that matters most happened 2 days after the crane was righted, on a Thursday evening, in Loretta Dawson's kitchen. Clayton drove up from his farm 30 miles south. He did not call ahead. He just appeared at the driveway at 6 o'clock the way sons appear when they have something to say that cannot be said over the phone. Something that requires the kitchen table and the coffee and the face of the person they need to say it to. Loretta was at the stove, heating soup. The kind of soup she made every week, chicken broth, vegetables from the garden, whatever was left from Sunday. She heard the truck pull in, heard the engine shut off. looked out the window and saw Clayton sitting in the cab for a long time before he got out. His hands were on the steering wheel. His head was slightly bowed. She knew that posture, a man working up to something. She had seen William sit in a truck like that. The night he told her his father was sick and they would have to leave Des Moines and come back to the farm. The night he told her the bank was calling the loan during the dry year of '63. The night before he died, though she did not know then that it was the night before, and she would give anything to have known, to have said something more than good night, to have held on a little longer. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and waited. Clayton came in, 47 years old, tall like his father, quiet like his father, stubborn like his mother, though he would never admit it and she would never say it because some truths are more useful when they go unspoken. He sat down at the table, the same chair he had sat in since he was a boy, the same table where Virgil had eaten breakfast every morning until he died, where William had done the farm books every evening until the farm all rolled, where Loretta had paid bills and planned crops and made decisions for 30 years alone. Clayton picked up the coffee, held it without drinking. Looked at the cup the way people look at objects when they are trying to find the words for something that doesn't fit easily into language. I heard about the crane, he said. News travels. Grant Hollister called me. He tracked down my number through the county clerk's office. Said you waded into mud up to your chest and fixed a chain with your bare hands at 78 years old. I was kneeling, not wading, and the mud was only up to my waist. Clayton did not smile. He was looking at something on the table, or through the table, or at something that was not in the room at all, something that existed only in memory, something that looked like a man on a caterpillar and a woman watching from the kitchen window, and a 17-year-old boy who did not know yet that he would spend 30 years trying to convince his mother to give up the thing that defined her. I've been thinking about the farm, he said. I know you have. You've been thinking about selling it for 2 years. I was wrong. The words came out rough. The way words come out when a man has been carrying them for a long time and they have grown edges. The way words come out when they cost something to say. When admitting them means admitting everything they imply, that you were wrong about the farm, wrong about the equipment, wrong about the caterpillar, wrong about your mother, wrong about what old things can do and what old people can do, and what a woman alone on 480 acres of Iowa farmland can accomplish with nothing but stubbornness and skill and a machine that was built before the stock market crash. I watched the video, Clayton said. Someone on the construction crew had recorded the recovery on a handheld camcorder, the bulky kind, with the flip-out screen and the grainy picture that would look primitive in a few years, but was miraculous in '95. By Thursday evening, copies of the tape were circulating through Carroll County like currency. The hardware store had a copy playing on the television in the break room. The diner had a copy. The co-op had a copy. Everyone in Carroll County, it seemed, had either seen the video or knew someone who had. I watched you drive that caterpillar down the hill, Clayton said. I watched you hook that chain. I watched you wade through mud that could have buried you. I watched you fix the hook when it slipped. And I watched you pull that crane up like it was just another day on the farm. It was just another day on the farm, Loretta said. Harder than most, but the same work. I know, that's what I'm trying to say. Clayton set down his coffee. The cup made a sound on the table, a small sound, but in the quiet kitchen it sounded like a gavel. I've been telling you to sell this farm for 2 years. Sell the land, sell the equipment, sell the caterpillar, move to town. I said you were too old. I said none of this mattered anymore. I said the caterpillar was a museum piece. He looked at his mother, really looked. The way Grant Hollister had looked at her on the riverbank, not seeing the age, not seeing the eyes, not seeing the overalls and the mud boots and the faded cap, but seeing the person underneath all of it, the person who had held everything together for 30 years. But I watched that video and I saw the look on those men's faces when that crane came up. And I saw the look on your face. And I realized something that I should have realized a long time ago. He paused. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The soup bubbled softly on the stove. Outside, the October wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree that Virgil had planted in 1920, the year he married, the year he decided the farm was permanent and planted a tree to prove it. This farm isn't just land and equipment, Clayton said. It's not just 480 acres of corn and beans and a tax bill that I've been worrying about for you. It's everything Virgil built when he homesteaded this land. It's everything Dad continued when he took over. And it's everything you held together for 30 years when everyone, Mom, including me, said you couldn't. Loretta's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup. They were still sore from the chain, still bruised where the steel links had pressed into her palms and the mud had ground against her skin. The bruises would last 2 weeks. The soreness would last a month. But the memory of what those hands had done would last forever, and she knew it, and Clayton knew it, and that was enough. She did not say anything. Some moments do not require words. They require silence and the willingness to let someone finish becoming who they are going to be. I'm not selling the farm, Clayton said, and I'm going to help you with the taxes. I called the county assessor this morning. We can file an agricultural exemption appeal based on the acreage and active production. It won't eliminate the increase, but it'll bring it down to something manageable. And I'm going to start coming up on weekends to help with the heavy work. He straightened in his chair. And when you're ready, not now, not soon, but when you're ready, I'll come back and run it, the way it's supposed to be run, with the caterpillar. Loretta took a sip of her coffee. It had gone cold while Clayton was talking, but she did not notice. Or if she noticed, she did not care. Some things are more important than the temperature of coffee. Your father would be proud of you, she said. My father would be proud of you, Clayton said. He always was. They sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, not talking about the crane, not talking about the farm, not talking about the taxes or the equipment or the caterpillar or any of the practical matters that would need to be addressed in the days and weeks ahead. Just sitting in the quiet, drinking cold coffee, listening to the wind and the clock and the small sounds of a farmhouse that has been holding a family together for 100 years. The kind of silence that sounds, if you listen carefully, like the space between two heartbeats, like a family putting itself back together, like forgiveness being accepted without being requested. Loretta Dawson continued farming until 2001 when she was 84 years old. She did not stop because she was unable to continue. She stopped because she was ready. There is a difference between being forced to quit and choosing to pass the work to someone who is ready to receive it, and Loretta knew the difference because she had watched Virgil make the same choice, and she had watched William prepare to make it before the farm all took the choice away from him. Clayton had been driving up from his farm on weekends for 6 years since that Thursday evening in the kitchen. He had been relearning the land, walking the fields, checking the fences, running the equipment, learning the caterpillar again, learning the feel of the steering clutches and the throttle, and the particular way the tracks responded to different soils. He had been learning the farm the way you learn a language you used to speak slowly at first, then faster, then with the fluency that comes from immersion and the understanding that this is not just a skill, but a way of being. In the spring of 2001, Clayton moved back to the farmhouse. He brought his wife Margaret. He brought his son Jesse, who was 14. The same age William had been when Virgil first let him drive the caterpillar. The same age Loretta had been when she first sat on a tractor on her father's farm in Calhoun County, 40 miles north before she met William, before she married into the Dawson family, before she became the person that the story needed her to be. The caterpillar was part of the inheritance, just as it had been when Virgil passed the farm to William. And when William died and Loretta held everything together with her hands and her will and a machine that did not know the word quit. Loretta moved into the smaller bedroom downstairs, the one that had been Virgil's room at the end. She said she liked it because it was closer to the bathroom. The truth was that she liked it because the window looked out toward the machine shed and she could see the caterpillar through the open door on mornings when the light was right. Clayton still fires up the caterpillar once a month. The ritual has not changed in 4 generations. Check the oil, check the coolant, check the track tension, prime the carburetor, set the throttle, gauge the crank. The engine coughs once, twice, then catches in the deep barking rhythm, fills the farmyard the way it has filled it. Since 1928, a sound that has become as much a part of the Dawson farm as the wind and the rain and the corn growing in the summer fields. Clayton takes the caterpillar to the county fair every summer, parks it in the machinery barn that the Historical Society built with the $25,000 from the crane rescue. People walk through and look at the machine and read the brass plaque and take photographs. Most of them smile and move on. He still gets calls from people with equipment stuck in places where modern machines cannot reach or cannot risk going. The soft shoulder of a drainage ditch, the muddy bank of a creek, the flooded bottom of a field after a September rain. Places where the ground is uncertain and the equipment is heavy and the computers in the cabs are flashing red warnings that say, "Do not proceed." Clayton proceeds with the caterpillar, the way his mother proceeded, the way his father would have proceeded, the way Virgil proceeded when the land was still being broken and the fields were still being cleared, and the only certainty was that the work needed to be done and the machine was willing to do it. In 2004, Clayton used the caterpillar to pull a combine out of a creek bed where it had slid during harvest. The combine was a late-model machine less than 3 years old, loaded with every piece of agricultural technology that money could buy. GPS guidance that could steer the machine across a field within an inch of the planned path. Auto steer that allowed the operator to take his hands off the wheel and let the satellite do the driving. Yield monitors that measured the volume and moisture content of the grain in real time and generated color-coded maps of field productivity. A satellite uplink that transmitted data to a farm management system in real time. $270,000 of 21st century engineering lying on its side in a creek bed because the bank had given way under the weight of a machine that was designed for flat fields, not sloped waterways. The combine's owner was a young farmer in his 30s. He stood on the bank of the creek and watched a 76-year-old machine, older than his grandfather, pull his $250,000 combine out of the water with a chain and a steady pull, and the same relentless patience that had righted a $500,000 crane 9 years earlier. When the combine was back on level ground, the young farmer walked over to Clayton and shook his hand and said something that Clayton has never forgotten. Something that captures the entire essence of what the Caterpillar 60 means and why this story matters. My combine has GPS auto-steer yield monitors and a satellite uplink, the young farmer said. Your tractor has a seat and a chain, and yours just saved mine. That's about right, Clayton said. He sounded like his mother. The same plainness, the same directness, the same quiet confidence of a person who knows what their machine can do because they have spent their life asking it. Loretta Dawson died in 2009 at the age of 92. She died in the downstairs bedroom of the farmhouse, in the room that had been Virgil's room, with the window that looked out toward the machine shed. She died in October, the same month the crane had fallen, the same month she had righted it, the same month the Iowa sky turns itself into a cathedral of light and distance, and the particular shade of blue that exists nowhere else on earth. Her funeral was held at the church in Carroll where Virgil Dawson had been married in 1894, the same church where William had been baptized and confirmed and married and eulogized. The church was full, not standing room full. People sat in the choir loft. People stood in the narthex, the narrow entrance hall, where generations of Carroll County families had hung their coats and stomped the mud off their boots before taking their seats. People stood outside with the doors open, listening through the autumn air, because Loretta Dawson had been part of Carroll County for so long that her absence felt like a change in the landscape, like a hill that had always been there, suddenly being gone, like a sound you had heard every day of your life, suddenly stopping, and the silence it left behind being louder than the sound had ever been. Grant Hollister came to the funeral. He was retired now, living in Des Moines in a house that was too big for one person and too quiet for a man who had spent his career surrounded by the noise of construction. 60 years old with a bad knee from a fall on a bridge project in '98, a good pension from Mercer Construction, and the slightly bewildered expression of a man who has stopped working and has not yet figured out what to do with the empty hours. He had driven 2 hours from Des Moines to Carroll County because some debts are not paid with money. Some debts are not paid with checks or donations or brass plaques. Some debts are paid with presence, with the act of showing up, with the willingness to drive 2 hours on a Tuesday morning to stand in a church and honor a woman who changed your life in 4 minutes on a riverbank 14 years ago. He found Clayton after the service in the church parking lot under the oak tree that the congregation had planted in 1950. Grant was wearing a dark suit that did not quite fit anymore. Clayton was wearing the same suit he had worn to his father's funeral 30 years earlier. They shook hands, the same handshake that Grant had given Loretta, a handshake that started formal and ended long. The handshake of two men connected by a woman who was no longer there and a machine that still was. That woman saved my career, Grant said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. She saved a $500,000 crane and a $20 million bridge project, and she did it with a machine older than my father. He paused, looked at the church, looked at the people filing out, the men in dark suits and the women in dark dresses and the farmers in their Sunday clothes, which in Carroll County meant clean jeans and a shirt with a collar. Looked at the Iowa sky, which was doing what the Iowa sky always does in October, turning itself into a cathedral of light and distance and the kind of blue that makes you understand why painters come to Iowa and musicians write songs about it and farmers stay on the land even when the land is trying to break them. I spent my whole career believing that newer was better, Grant said, that the latest technology, the biggest budget, the most advanced equipment, that's what solved problems. That's what I was trained to believe. That's what the industry taught me. That's what the computers confirmed. Newer, bigger, faster, smarter. He looked at Clayton. Your mother taught me something different. Something I should have learned from my own grandfather if I'd been listening. He paused again. The parking lot was quiet. The last of the mourners were getting into their cars. The oak tree above them moved in the October wind. The question isn't how old the machine is, Grant said. The question is whether the person running it knows what they're doing. Clayton nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. Grant put his hand on Clayton's shoulder, held it there. A moment that was not quite a handshake and not quite a hug and was somehow more than both. Take care of that caterpillar, Grant said. Yes, sir, Clayton said. And take care of this farm. Yes, sir. Grant drove back to Des Moines that afternoon. 2 hours on Highway 30 through the Iowa fields past the small towns and the grain elevators and the farmsteads that dot the landscape like anchors holding the prairie in place. He drove with the window down despite the October chill because the air smelled like Iowa, and Iowa smelled like the day he had watched a 78-year-old woman pull his crane out of the mud, and he wanted to remember that smell for as long as he could. The Caterpillar 60 is still on the Dawson farm. It sits in the machine shed in the same spot it has occupied since Virgil drove it home from the dealer in 1928. The shed has been rebuilt twice, once in '54 when a windstorm took the roof and once in '83 when Loretta replaced the walls with steel siding because the original wood had rotted beyond repair. But the concrete floor is the same floor Virgil poured in, 29 the year after he bought the machine, and the Caterpillar's tracks rest in the same grooves they have been wearing into that concrete for nearly a century. Jesse Dawson, the fourth generation, learned to drive the Caterpillar at 14. The same age Loretta had been when she first drove a tractor. The same age William had been when Virgil let him take the controls. The same age Virgil's own son had been before all of them. The tradition has not been discussed or formalized or written down. It simply happens. At 14, a Dawson child sits on the steel seat for the first time, and the person next to them, whoever is left, whoever is carrying the knowledge forward, teaches them the controls, the throttle, the steering clutches, the way the engine sounds when it is working, and the way it sounds when it is straining, the feel of the tracks on different ground, the patience required to let a machine do its work at its own pace, which is not fast and is not flashy, but is relentless. Jesse is in his 30s now. He runs the farm with his father. He has modern equipment too, a GPS-guided combine, a four-wheel drive tractor with a climate-controlled cab, a computer in the farmhouse that tracks yields and commodity prices and weather forecasts in real time. He uses all of it. He is not his grandmother. He does not reject new technology on principle. But when something is stuck, when something is mired, when the ground is soft and the load is heavy, and the modern equipment's computers are flashing their red warnings and refusing to engage, Jesse walks to the machine shed and fires up the Caterpillar 60. The engine coughs once, twice, catches on the third pull. The deep barking rhythm fills the farmyard. The tracks begin to move, and Jesse drives the machine out into the field, or down to the creek, or across the county road to wherever the problem is, and he hooks the chain, the same chain, Virgil's chain, 67 years old, and then some, and he pulls. The machine has been in the family for 97 years now. It has outlasted 4 generations of farmers. It has outlasted dozens of modern tractors that arrived with great fanfare and left with rust and regret. It has outlasted at least one $500,000 crane. It has outlasted every prediction of its obsolescence, every suggestion that it be donated or scrapped or retired, every reasonable argument that a machine from 1928 has no place in a 21st century farming operation. The engine still starts on the third pole. The tracks still grip. The grouser bars still bite into earth the way they did the day Virgil Dawson drove the machine off the dealer's lot in Peoria, Illinois, 1928, believing with the quiet certainty of a man who worked with his hands that the right tool properly maintained would outlast the man who bought it. He was right. It has outlasted all of them, and it will outlast more. Jesse takes the Caterpillar to the Carroll County Fair every summer. He parks it in the machinery barn that his grandmother's rescue helped build. The barn is well maintained. The display space is clean. The brass plaque is polished. People walk through and look at the machine and read the words on the plaque and take photographs. Some of them smile and shake their heads at the idea of a 1928 tractor riding a modern crane. Some of them linger. Some of them stand in front of the machine and are quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet in the presence of something they cannot quite explain but know is important. And every once in a while, someone old enough to remember stops in front of the Caterpillar and looks at it for a long time. And if Jesse is nearby, standing by the display, the way his grandmother used to stand by it, answering questions with the same plainness and directness that Loretta had learned from Virgil and taught to Clayton, and Clayton had taught to Jesse, they ask him the same question. Is it true about the crane? Yes, sir, Jesse says. My grandmother pulled it up. 1995. Took her about 4 minutes. By herself? By herself. She was 78. And the person will shake their head, and they will look at the machine again. And you can see them revising something in their minds. Some assumption about what old things can do, about what old people can do, about what a woman can do when everyone tells her she cannot, about the difference between what a computer says is possible and what a person with 67 years of accumulated knowledge and a machine that does not know when to quit can actually accomplish when everyone else has given up and gone home. And every time someone says that old thing cannot help, every time an engineer runs the calculation and a computer says no, and a modern machine protects itself from what needs to be done because the numbers say the risk is too high, and the protocol says stand down, and the manual says this operation is outside design parameters, the Dawson family fires up the Caterpillar, hooks the chain, and proves them wrong. The engineers laughed. The crane fell over. The old machine pulled it back up. That is what happens when you build something that does not know when to quit. And that is what happens when the person running it does not know when to quit either. Loretta Dawson never quit. Not when they told her to sell the farm the day after her husband's funeral. Not when the bank said she was finished during the 80s crisis. Not when her own son spent 2 years trying to convince her that the Caterpillar was scrap metal and the farm was a burden and her life would be easier if she just let go. Not when she walked down to the riverbank and a construction site full of men laughed at her. Not when the insurance adjuster threatened to void the coverage. Not when the chain slipped and every man on the bank thought it was over. She just kept pulling. The way the machine kept pulling. The way Virgil pulled when the stumps were deep and the roots were stubborn and the Iowa earth did not want to give up what it was holding. The way William pulled when the fields flooded and the equipment was stuck and the only option was to hook the chain and not stop until the job was done. The way Loretta pulled for 30 years alone on 480 acres through drought and flood and debt and grief and the relentless daily unglamorous work of keeping a farm alive and a family together and a legacy intact. She pulled until the job was done, the way the Caterpillar always does.